smelling of lemon polish and copper. The house was quiet. It was Tuesday, 4 p.m., and Declan wasn't supposed to be here. Shrugging off his wet wool coat, he felt the heavy fabric that stank of the damp city. Then he saw her. Standing at the edge of the hallway was Tessa, the quiet girl who scrubbed his floors. With white knuckles and wide, terrified eyes, she pressed a trembling finger to her lips. "Stay silent," she breathed. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It hung in the air like a wet, grey sheet. Declan Walsh hated the damp. It seeped into the marrow of his bones, aggravating the old gunshot wound in his left shoulder, a dull, throbbing reminder of a life he had tried and failed to sterilize. He was 38, but his joints felt 50. The leather of his steering wheel was slick under his palms as he pulled the Mercedes into the subterranean garage of his Mercer Island estate. He was home 3 hours early. The sit-down with the Moretti crew had fallen apart before the espresso was even poured. A disagreement over port taxes, 2 men dead in a warehouse, and Declan had simply walked out, exhausted by the endless cyclical stupidity of his profession. He just wanted a shower. He wanted the scalding water to burn the smell of cordite and cheap cigar smoke off his skin. He wanted the quiet of his heavily fortified, tragically empty house. The garage door rattled shut behind him, sealing him in a concrete tomb of halogen lights and luxury cars he rarely drove. He punched the 6-digit code into the keypad of the interior door. It clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. The mudroom was warm. The heated slate floors immediately went to work on the damp soles of his Oxfords. He shrugged off his overcoat. It weighed 10 pounds, soaking wet, reeking of exhaust and the metallic tang of city rain. He draped it over a mahogany hook, not caring that the water pooled on the custom woodwork. He loosened his silk tie, the fabric dragging roughly against his Adam's apple. He stepped into the main foyer. The house was usually silent at this hour, wrapped in the artificial hush that only extreme wealth could buy. The security team stayed on the perimeter. The indoor staff knew to keep to the service wings. Declan craved this isolation. He had built this fortress to keep the world out, to keep his enemies on the other side of bulletproof glass and reinforced steel. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, feeling the grit of the day under his fingernails. Then a floorboard creaked. A sharp, distinct sound that didn't belong to the natural settling of the house. Declan froze. His right hand instinctively dropped to his waist, fingers brushing the cold, textured grip of the compact Sig Sauer tucked into his waistband. He didn't draw it. Not yet. He just stood there, letting his eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the UV-tinted windows. A shadow shifted near the archway, leading to the west wing. Declan's thumb released the safety on the gun. A tiny metallic snick. "Mr. Walsh." The voice was barely a wisp of air, fragile and frantic. Declan exhaled his grip on the gun, loosening slightly. It was Tessa, the new maid. She had been working at the estate for maybe 4 months. He barely knew her. She was a ghost in a grey uniform, a young woman who kept her head down, scrubbed the grout until her hands bled, and never made eye contact. He knew from his background checks that she was 24, had a mountain of medical debt from a sick mother, and possessed a pristine, utterly boring criminal record. She was safe. Invisible. But she wasn't invisible right now. She stood at the edge of the hallway, pressing herself against the flocked wallpaper, as if trying to merge with it. Her grey uniform was slightly rumpled. She wasn't holding a duster or a spray bottle. Her hands were empty, balled into tight fists at her sides. Her knuckles were stark white, devoid of blood. Declan took a step forward, his heavy shoes loud against the hardwood. "Tessa." "What are you?" She lunged. It wasn't a graceful movement. It was jagged and desperate. She closed the distance between them in 2 panicked strides, and grabbed his forearm. Declan's muscles locked. In his world, people did not touch him uninvited. Men had lost fingers for less. His immediate instinct was violence, to throw her off, to draw the weapon to establish dominance. But the sheer terror radiating off her stopped him. He could smell it. It wasn't a metaphor. Fear has a scent, sour sharp, mingling with the cheap lavender soap she used to wash her clothes. She was trembling so violently that the vibration travelled through the wet sleeve of his suit jacket and into his own skin. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, were blown wide, the pupils dilated until they were almost entirely black. She stared up at him, her chest heaving. She pressed a shaking, raw-knuckled finger to her lips. "Stay silent," she breathed. The words barely carried over the steady drumming of the rain against the skylights. Declan stared at her. His irritation vanished, replaced by a cold, creeping spike of adrenaline. He didn't ask why. He didn't demand an explanation. You don't survive 20 years in the Seattle Syndicate by ignoring the primal instincts of prey animals. Tessa was currently acting like a rabbit that had just smelled a wolf. He gave her a single tight nod. Tessa swallowed hard, her throat bobbing. She didn't let go of his arm. Instead, she used it to pull him gently but firmly toward the arched hallway of the West Wing. The West Wing. Declan's stomach hollowed out. The West Wing wasn't a guest area. It wasn't an office. It was a mausoleum. It housed the master suite retrofitted 2 years ago into a high-tech medical facility. It was where his wife, Camille, lay in a specialized bed, tethered to feeding tubes, and a ventilator suspended in a persistent vegetative state. 2 years ago, a rival crew had wired Declan's car with C4. Declan had taken a different ride that morning. Camille had taken the wired one. The blast had thrown the vehicle 30 feet. She had survived miraculously, but the brain trauma was catastrophic. The doctors said she would never wake up. Declan had spent the last 24 months dismantling the crew responsible piece by bloody piece, turning the streets into an abattoir in her name. He spent his evenings sitting beside her silent form, holding a hand that never squeezed back, crushed by the suffocating weight of guilt. He paid millions to a private medical team, Dr. Orris, and a rotation of highly vetted nurses to keep her comfortable, to keep her alive. Tessa led him to the edge of the hallway. She stopped just before the corner. She let go of his arm, pointing a trembling finger toward the master suite. The heavy double doors usually kept wide open, so the nurses could hear everything were pulled shut. Except for a crack. A sliver of warm yellow light spilled out onto the Persian runner in the hall. Tessa looked up at Declan. Tears were pooling in the corners of her eyes, spilling over her lashes, tracking through the faint dust on her cheeks. She mouthed a single word. "Look." Declan's hand returned to his gun. He drew it this time. The weight of the Sig Sauer anchored him. He stepped past the maid, moving with a practiced silent glide, heel to toe, distributing his weight. He approached the crack in the door. The smell of the West Wing hit him, antiseptic sterile alcohol, wipes the faint vanilla lotion they use to massage Camille's atrophying limbs. But there was no steady rhythmic hiss of the ventilator. There was no beeping from the heart monitor. The room was quiet. Too quiet. He pressed his back against the doorframe, adjusting his grip on the steel. He closed his left eye, bringing his right eye to the sliver of space between the door and the jamb. The sight through the crack in the door didn't compute. Declan's brain, trained to analyze threat levels, calculate firing angles, and process violence in milliseconds, simply stalled. It was like looking at an optical illusion, a picture that forces the mind to rebel. The hospital bed, the expensive articulated monstrosity that dominated the center of the room, was empty. The white thermal blankets were thrown back, rumpled and discarded. The IV stand stood naked, its saline bags unhooked, a clear fluid dripping steadily onto the hardwood floor, pooling in a small, pathetic puddle. Declan's breath hitched. A spike of pure, unadulterated panic hit him. They took her. Someone breached the house. Someone bypassed the perimeter, got past the guards, and took a comatose woman. The audacity, the sheer impossible logistics of it. He was about to kick the door open to sound the alarm to turn the city inside out. Then she walked into his line of sight. Camille. Declan didn't kick the door. He didn't move. He stopped breathing entirely. She wasn't being carried. She wasn't bound or gagged. She was walking. Her gait was smooth, balanced, entirely devoid of the muscle atrophy the doctors had spent hours explaining to him. She wasn't wearing the pale blue hospital gowns he bought by the dozen. She was wearing a black cashmere turtleneck and tailored dark denim. Clothes from her old closet. Clothes she hadn't worn in 2 years. Her dark hair, which the nurses kept braided to prevent tangles, was loose falling in familiar, glossy waves past her shoulders. She looked healthy. Her skin was flushed. She looked exactly as she had on the morning of the bombing. Declan's knees turned to water. The gun in his hand suddenly felt like a toy, a ridiculous, useless prop. A profound, violent nausea slammed into his gut, a physical blow that sent bile crawling up the back of his throat. He had to clamp his jaw shut to keep from gagging. Camille crossed the room to the large oil painting of the Amalfi Coast, hanging on the far wall. She reached behind the frame, her fingers dancing over the hidden keypad. Declan watched, paralyzed, as she punched in the 6-digit code. His code. The code only he knew. The safe hissed open. Camille reached inside and began pulling out thick, banded stacks of $100 bills. She didn't look frantic. She looked bored. She tossed the bricks of cash onto a leather duffel bag resting on the armchair nearby. She was talking. Declan strained to hear the blood roaring in his ears like a freight train deafening him. He pressed his ear closer to the wood. "Told you it doesn't matter," Camille was saying. She had a phone wedged between her shoulder and her ear. A cheap black burner. Her voice was crisp, clear. Not the raspy, unused croak of a miracle awakening. It was the voice of a woman who had been speaking every single day. "Aris is getting antsy," she continued, zipping the duffel bag halfway. "He wants his final cut. Pay him Elias. I don't care if you think he's greedy. Just pay the doctor and put a bullet in him next week. I'm not leaving loose ends." Elias. Elias Thorne was dead. Declan had put a bullet between Elias's eyes 18 months ago. He had done it in a rainy shipping yard, screaming Camille's name, avenging the bombing. Or so he thought. If she was talking to Elias, the floor dropped out from under Declan's reality. There was no ground left. There was only a terrifying, free-falling void. "Elias is managing the offshore transfers," she said, confirming the impossible. "Yes, the Cayman accounts. Declan is a sentimental idiot. He never moved the funds. He thought keeping everything static was a tribute to my memory. God, he's so predictable." She laughed. It was a short, breathy sound. The exact laugh she used to give when they shared a private joke across a crowded gala. The laugh he had played in his head on loop during the darkest, most alcohol-soaked nights of his grief. Hearing it now felt like taking a razor blade directly to the eyeball. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a sudden recovery. It was a performance. A 2-year, multi-million-dollar theatrical production starring his wife, his private medical staff, and the man he thought he had killed. They had faked the coma. They had faked the agonizing decline. They had used his grief, his desperate need to protect her, to siphon money, to feed him false intelligence, to watch him dismantle his own empire while hunting ghosts. He remembered the nights he had spent sitting in the chair she was currently using as a luggage stand. He remembered holding her limp hand, pressing it to his wet face, begging her to come back. He remembered confessing his fears to her, outlining his vulnerabilities, detailing the locations of his hidden assets, thinking he was talking to a sleeping angel who could do nothing but listen. She had been listening, wide awake behind closed eyes, cataloguing every weakness. The humiliation burned hotter than the betrayal. He didn't feel like a Mafia boss. He didn't feel dangerous. He felt profoundly, intensely stupid. A mark, a clown in a bespoke suit, weeping over a woman who was actively robbing him. He watched as Camille zipped the bag shut. "I'm leaving tonight," she said into the phone. "The shift change is at 5. The idiot maid is doing laundry in the East Wing. Declan is stuck in negotiations with the Italians. The house is a tomb. I'll meet you at the airstrip." Declan lowered the gun. He didn't burst in. He didn't scream. The anger hadn't arrived yet. The shock was too absolute, too paralyzing. He felt detached from his own body, as if he were floating near the ceiling, watching a pathetic man standing in a hallway, realizing his entire life was a carefully constructed diorama of lies. He took a step back. His leather sole scraped against the floorboard. A tiny sound. Inside the room, Camille stopped moving. She went perfectly rigid. Declan didn't wait to see if she turned around. He backed away, his movements clumsy, robotic. He retreated down the hall, the shadows swallowing him. He bumped into the wall, the plaster rough against his shoulder. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed to wake up from this nightmare. He turned the corner, almost colliding with a small grey figure. Tessa. She was exactly where he had left her, her arms wrapped around her own waist, shaking like a leaf in a winter storm. She looked at his face, and whatever she saw there made a small whimper escape her throat. Declan didn't speak. He grabbed her by the upper arm. His grip was entirely devoid of gentleness. He hauled her down the intersecting hallway, moving fast, practically dragging her off her feet. He bypassed the kitchen, bypassing the main living areas, pulling her toward the one room in the house that had no windows, no smart home microphones and thick walls. The laundry room. The laundry room smelled aggressively of artificial spring breeze and hot lint. It was a stark utilitarian box, hidden inside a gilded cage. White enamel machines hummed faintly on standby. The harsh fluorescent lighting cast deep, unflattering shadows under Tessa's eyes as Declan shoved her inside and slammed the heavy door shut behind them. The deadbolt clicked. It sounded like a hammer striking an anvil in the cramped space. He backed her against the vibrating side of an industrial washing machine. His fingers dug into the cheap polyester of her uniform. His chest heaved. He fought the nausea, still threatening to empty his stomach onto the linoleum floor. He didn't yell. Yelling was a luxury for men who felt in control. Declan sounded like a man choking on glass. "How long?" he rasped. The words tore at his throat. Tessa shrank against the metal, turning her face away. She squeezed her eyes shut. Tears broke free, tracking fast down her pale cheeks. She was terrified of him, and she should be. He was a violent man. But right now the violence was turned entirely inward, shredding his own organs. "Huh? How long what?" she stammered. Declan shook her, just enough to rattle her teeth. "Do not lie to me. Not today. You knew. You told me to stay silent. How long have you known she was awake?" Tessa let out a sharp, ugly sob. 3 days, she whispered rapidly, the words spilling like water from a cracked pipe. 3 days ago. Please, Mr. Walsh, don't hurt me. 3 days. The words tasted like ash. He let go of her arm as if the polyester burned him. He stepped back, bracing his hands on the edge of the deep utility sink, staring blankly down the stainless steel drain. I was supposed to be off. Tessa babbled her raw hands, fluttering near her chest. A pipe burst in the basement. I stayed late to mop. The night nurse went out to the terrace to smoke. I was bringing fresh towels to the hall closet. Declan closed his eyes. The quiet house, the lazy, expensive staff. I heard a voice from the master suite. I thought someone broke in. I peeked through the hinge of the door. I saw her. Mrs. Walsh. Tessa swallowed audibly. She was sitting up. She was eating a sandwich and watching an iPad. When the nurse came back, she just handed her the plate and lay back down. Declan gripped the sink's edge. His tendons screamed. "And you didn't tell me." It was a heavy, flat accusation. Tessa finally looked at him. The sheer terror in her pale eyes, mixed with something far worse, pity. "Tell you what?" she asked, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "That the wife you worship is faking it. Who would you believe, Mr. Walsh? The doctors with their fancy degrees, your security team, or the girl who scrubs your grout for minimum wage?" Declan flinched. The truth was a physical blow. She was right. If she had come to him raving about a sandwich, he would have thought she was insane. He might have told Dr. Aris, and Aris would have handled it. "They saw me yesterday," Tessa confessed. She wrapped her arms around her waist, making herself as small as possible. "Dr. Aris caught me looking. He grabbed my throat, pushed me against the wall." She tilted her chin up slightly. Declan saw it then. A faint, yellowish bruise forming on her neck just above the collar. The ghost of the doctor's thumb. "He told me if I ever breathed a word to you, he'd make sure my mother's life support was turned off. He said he had friends at her hospital. He knew her room number." The puzzle pieces snapped together, severing his last artery of hope. His entire medical staff was compromised. They were using his fortress to hide Camille in plain sight, funneling his wealth, all while holding a maid's dying mother as collateral. "Why today?" Declan asked softly. He stared at a box of powdered detergent on the shelf. "If they threatened you, why stop me today?" Tessa wiped her nose with the back of her hand. She looked down at the linoleum. "Because I heard her on the phone this morning. She said today was the day. You were at the docks. You wouldn't be back until midnight." Tessa's voice broke. She told Aris to leave the gas stove on when they left. She was going to burn the house down, with me in it, with the rest of the staff in it, to cover her tracks. I was trying to run away when you walked through the door. The silence in the laundry room was absolute, save for the hum of the appliances. Burn him out. Erase the fortress. Erase the maid. The numbness paralyzing Declan began to thaw. It didn't become a fiery, righteous anger. It crystallized into a dark, heavy ice at the base of his spine. The nausea faded. A ruthless, hyper-focused clarity replaced it. The exact instinct he possessed before grief made him soft and stupid. Camille wasn't a tragedy anymore. She was a target. Declan pushed off the sink. He stood up straight, his joints popping. He reached to his waistband, drawing the Sig Sauer. It didn't feel useless anymore. It was a tool. He checked the magazine. 13 rounds. He slid it back. He looked at Tessa. She was trembling again, staring at the gun. "You did good, Tessa," he said. His voice was a dead, flat calm. The voice of the man who ran the Seattle Underground. He pulled a thick money clip from his jacket pocket. He detached a stack of crisp hundreds, maybe $5,000, and held it out. Tessa didn't move. "Take it," Declan ordered softly. "There's a service door at the back of this room. It leads to the greenhouse path. Walk into the woods, it spits you out on the highway. Walk 2 miles north to the diner. Call a cab. Go to your mother's hospital. Stay in her room. Do not go home. Do not answer unknown numbers." Tessa slowly reached out her cracked fingers, brushing his as she took the cash. "What are you going to do?" Declan turned toward the heavy door. He placed his hand on the handle. He couldn't look back at her humanity. He needed the ice. "I'm going to have a conversation with my wife." The house no longer felt like a tomb. It felt like a trap, its invisible jaws pulled wide, waiting for him to step on the trigger plate. Declan walked down the main corridor, his leather soles rolling heel to toe. He bypassed the Persian rugs, sticking to the bare oak floorboards near the walls, where the wood was less likely to groan. He didn't head straight for the master suite. He detoured toward the kitchen. A faint, rhythmic dripping sound echoed from the butler's pantry, accompanied by the low, expensive hum of the espresso machine grinding beans. The sheer domesticity of the noise made Declan's jaw clench. Someone was making coffee, while his wife plotted to burn his estate to the ground and run off with a dead man. Someone was frothing milk. Declan flattened his back against the cool plaster beside the kitchen archway. He peeked around the corner. Dr. Aris stood by the marble island. He was a man in his late 40s, impeccably groomed with silvering hair and a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than Tessa earned in 2 years. He didn't look like a physician tending to a dying woman. He looked like a hedge fund manager waiting for a flight to Zurich. Aris tapped his phone screen with one hand while holding a porcelain demitasse cup in the other. He smiled at something on the screen, a genuine, relaxed smile. The anger finally hit Declan. It didn't burn hot. It was a freezing, absolute zero cold that crystallized in his lungs, making his breath come in shallow, sharp pulls. For 2 years he had devored to this man. He had listened to Aris's solemn, hushed tones, delivering fake neurological reports. He had watched this man pretend to check the pupillary response of a woman who was perfectly awake. He had written him checks with 7 zeros. Declan stepped into the kitchen. He didn't bother hiding his footsteps anymore. Aris looked up, annoyed by the interruption. His eyes tracked the wet wool of Declan's suit, moving up to his face, and then finally down to the black steel of the Sig Sauer, pointed directly at his sternum. The doctor's relaxed smile didn't fade. It shattered. The porcelain cup slipped from his fingers. It hit the marble counter with a sharp, crack-brown liquid, splashing across the pristine white surface and dripping onto Aris's polished Italian loafers. "Mr. Walsh," Aris croaked. His voice was instantly stripped of its usual smooth authority. It was thin and reedy. You're home early." Declan didn't speak. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides. Aris threw his hands up, taking a panicked step backward, his heel slipping on the spilled espresso. Before the doctor could regain his balance, Declan grabbed him by the knot of his silk tie. He didn't just hold him. He used the fabric as a leash, jerking Aris forward and slamming him face first into the stainless steel double refrigerator. The impact was sickeningly loud. The metal dented. Aris let out a muffled shriek, his nose flattening against the steel. Declan jammed the barrel of the gun directly into the soft spot behind the doctor's ear, pressing hard enough to scrape the skin. He leaned in, smelling the sharp, expensive bergamot cologne Aris wore, now soured by the instant sweat pouring off the man's pores. "Elias," Declan whispered, his voice a dry rasp against the doctor's ear. "Where is he?" Aris was hyperventilating, his breath fogging the polished steel of the fridge. I I don't know what you're talking about. Declan, please, you're having an episode. The stress. Declan pulled the doctor back an inch and slammed his face into the metal a second time. A wet crunch echoed in the kitchen. Aris dropped to his knees, but Declan held him up by the ruined tie, letting the man's weight hang awkwardly. Blood poured from Aris's shattered nose, thick and dark red, dripping down his chin and staining his crisp white collar. The coma is over, Doctor, Declan said softly. The curtain is down. Do not insult my intelligence by staying in character. Where is Elias? Aris sobbed a pathetic bubbling sound through the blood. The sophisticated facade dissolved entirely, leaving behind a terrified, greedy man who realized he had miscalculated his own mortality. Renton, he gasped, spitting a tooth onto the slate floor. The private airstrip in Renton. Hangar 4. He's waiting for her. And the perimeter guards? Declan asked, twisting the tie tighter, cutting off Aris's air supply. My men outside. Did you buy them? Elias bought them. Aris wheezed his face, turning a mottled purple. The night shift. They're his now. They have orders to let us out and lock the gates. Declan processed the information. He was completely boxed in. His own men were standing outside in the rain, holding rifles, waiting to secure his tomb. Please, Aris begged his hands, weakly clawing at Declan's wrist. I'm just a contractor. She offered me $5 million. I have debts. Declan didn't care about his debts. He didn't care about his excuses. He shifted his grip, grabbed a fistful of the doctor's silver hair, and brought the heavy steel butt of the pistol down hard against the man's temple. Aris's eyes rolled back. His body went entirely slack, dropping to the floor like a sack of wet cement. He lay there unconscious, bleeding quietly onto the expensive slate. Declan stood over him, his chest heaving. His knuckles ached from the grip on the gun. He wiped a stray splatter of the doctor's blood off his cheek with the back of his hand. It smeared, sticky and warm. He turned away from the body, his boots crunching on the shards of the broken Demitas cup, and walked back toward the west wing. It was time to see his wife. The door to the master suite was still cracked open, exactly as Declan had left it. The sliver of yellow light cut across the hallway carpet. He didn't bother looking through the crack this time. He just pushed the heavy mahogany wood with the flat of his hand. The door swung inward with a faint, smooth hiss of well-oiled hinges. Camille was standing by the mirror above the dresser. She had a tube of lipstick in her hand, a deep, bruised plum color. She was applying it with practiced precision, her lips parted slightly. The duffel bag, swollen with his cash, sat on the armchair by the window. The hospital smell was gone. The harsh scent of antiseptic and bleach had been overpowered by something else. Sandalwood and vanilla. Her perfume. She had actually taken the time to spray her old perfume. The sheer vanity of it felt like a knife twisting in his gut. She saw his reflection in the mirror before he spoke. Her hand froze. The lipstick hovered a fraction of an inch from her mouth. For 2 agonizing seconds, the room was perfectly still. The silence was absolute. Then Camille slowly lowered the lipstick. She didn't drop it in shock. She capped it a soft click that sounded deafening and turned to face him. Declan had expected her to scream. He had expected her to panic, to reach for a weapon to try and lie her way out of it. He hadn't expected the look of deep, profound irritation that washed over her face. She looked at him, the way one looks at a delayed flight or a stain on a new blouse. An inconvenience. You're supposed to be at the docks, she said. Her voice was steady, utterly devoid of the raspy weakness she had feigned for 24 months. Declan stared at her. The woman he loved, the woman he had mourned, the woman whose lifeless hand he had held while he cried in the dark, was standing 10 feet away, in a black cashmere sweater, looking mildly annoyed that he had ruined her schedule. "The sit-down ended early," Declan said. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, hollow metallic. Camille sighed, crossing her arms over her chest. "Of course it did. You never could handle the Italians properly, Declan. Too much emotion. Too little leverage." He took a step into the room, letting the door click shut behind him. The sound seemed to finalize something, a heavy seal, locking them both in. He raised the gun, keeping it pointed at her center mass. His hand wasn't shaking. He was perfectly numb. "Elias is dead," Declan said, trying to find some crack in her armor, some trace of humanity. "I shot him in the face, Camille. I watched him drop." Camille let out a short, humorless laugh. "You shot his brother Declan. Julian. You were so blinded by grief, so desperate for blood, you didn't even verify the target. Elias just let you take the win. It was convenient for both of us." Declan swallowed. His throat was raw. "Both of us. You and the man who wired your car with C4. "Oh, please," Camille sneered, rolling her eyes. The mundane gesture was grotesque given the context. "Elias didn't wire the car. I did." The words didn't compute immediately. They hung in the air heavy and poisonous. "You did," Declan repeated softly. "It was a controlled blast," she said, pacing a few steps toward the window, completely unbothered by the gun trained on her. "A shaped charge under the rear axle. I timed it perfectly. The impact was supposed to throw me clear. The coma was just insurance. A way to step off the board while you and Elias tore the city apart. Why?" The word tore out of Declan, a jagged, pathetic sound. He hated himself for asking. He hated that a part of him, the stupid, broken part, still wanted an excuse. "I gave you everything." "You gave me a cage." She snapped her eyes, finally flashing with real heat. "A gilded, paranoid, suffocating cage. I didn't want to be a mob wife, Declan. I didn't want to spend my life hiding behind bulletproof glass, waiting for some rival crew to take a shot at me. I wanted out. And I wanted my half." She gestured toward the duffel bag. "Consider it alimony." Declan looked at the woman he had worshipped. He looked for a trace of the girl he had married 10 years ago in a small church in Portland. She wasn't there. Maybe she never had been. He realized with a sickening clarity that he was looking at a stranger. A ruthless, parasitic stranger who had hollowed him out and worn his grief like a comfortable coat. "You were going to burn the house down," he stated, "with the staff inside." Camille shrugged, brushing a speck of dust off her cashmere sleeve. "Collateral damage. The fire marshal would find my remains in the bed. Dental records are so easily swapped these days. It was the cleanest exit." "You are a monster," Declan breathed. "I'm a survivor," she corrected her voice, dropping to a low, dangerous register. "And you're a sentimental dinosaur, Declan. You're holding a gun on me, but you won't pull the trigger. You still love the ghost in that bed." She was right. The gun felt impossibly heavy. His finger rested against the trigger guard, paralyzed by a decade of muscle memory of protecting this woman at all costs. His brain knew she was the enemy, but his body was rebelling. He couldn't reconcile the target in front of him with the wife he had grieved. Camille saw his hesitation, the micro-expression of doubt. She smiled, a sharp, predatory lifting of the corners of her mouth. "Put the gun down, Declan," she commanded, softly taking a slow step toward the armchair, toward the duffel bag. "We can make a deal. I'll leave the money. I'll just walk out. You can tell your men I died peacefully in my sleep. You get closure. I get my freedom." Declan watched her hand slide toward the zipper of the bag. He knew what was inside. It wasn't just cash. The zipper teeth rasped quietly in the silent room. "Don't," Declan warned, his voice cracking. "Camille, don't." She didn't stop. Her fingers dipped past the canvas edge. Her eyes never left his, cold and calculating. She was betting her life that he was still the pathetic, broken man who cried beside her bed. She pulled the snub-nosed revolver from the bag in a blur of motion. She was fast, but she had been lying in a bed for 2 years. Her muscles, despite the secret physical therapy, weren't quite as sharp as she thought. Declan didn't think. The numbness vanished, replaced by pure reactive instinct. He didn't aim for the head. He didn't aim for the heart. He just squeezed the trigger of the Sig Sauer. The gunshot in the bedroom was deafening, a physical shockwave that blew the scent of sandalwood apart. The gunshot didn't just ring in the room. It compressed the air, a violent atmospheric shift that punched the breath from Declan's lungs. The sound slapped against the reinforced soundproofed walls and rebounded, a deafening physical force that blew the delicate scent of sandalwood entirely apart. It was instantly replaced by the harsh metallic sting of cordite. Through the expanding grey haze of powder smoke, Declan watched the kinetic transfer of energy. The 9mm hollow point caught Camille high on the right side, just beneath the collarbone. It wasn't a clean cinematic hit. It was a brutal stopping force. The impact spun her half around. The snub-nosed revolver slipped from her fingers, clattering against the hardwood with a pathetic, hollow clack. She didn't scream. The air in her lungs had been violently expelled. She simply crumpled her knees, folding beneath her, collapsing against the side of the articulated hospital bed she had used as a prop for 2 years. She slid down the metal railing, leaving a thick, dark smear until she hit the floor. Declan's ears emitted a high, continuous whine. He lowered the Sig Sauer. His hands, steady a fraction of a second ago, were now trembling so violently the gun rattled against his knuckles. He didn't feel the cold, righteous vindication of a man who had just taken back his life. He felt profoundly, catastrophically sick. The acid in his stomach churned, burning the back of his throat. He forced his legs to move. His heavy Oxfords dragged against the plush Persian rug. He stepped over the bricks of cash scattered on the floor, the money useless and absurd in the face of the pooling blood. He stopped 2 feet from her. Camille was on her back. Her breathing was wet and ragged, a terrible bubbling sound that hitched with every inhalation. The black cashmere of her sweater was soaked through, turning a heavy, glistening crimson. She pressed her left hand against the wound, her perfectly manicured fingernails instantly coated in her own blood. She looked up at him. The arrogant, untouchable facade was entirely gone. Her pale blue eyes were wide, blown out with shock and the dawning, terrifying realization of her own mortality. "You," she gasped. A thin line of red spilled over her bottom lip, ruining the plum lipstick. "You shot me." It wasn't an accusation. It was pure, unadulterated bewilderment. She genuinely hadn't believed he was capable of it. She had bet her life on his weakness, on the broken, weeping man who had sat by her bedside for 2 years. Declan stared down at her. He looked for the grief. He waited for the crushing weight of sorrow to drop on his chest, for the tears to blur his vision. But the reservoir was completely dry. He had mourned this woman already. He had buried her in his heart 1,000 times. The person bleeding out on his expensive rug wasn't his wife. It was the architect of his misery. "I did," Declan said. His voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the ringing in his ears. He didn't kneel. He didn't reach out to touch her face or brush the hair from her sweating forehead. He nudged her dropped revolver away with the toe of his shoe, sliding it safely out of her reach under the heavy dresser. Camille's chest heaved. She tried to pull a full breath, but the damaged lung wouldn't allow it. She choked a weak, wet cough that sprayed fine droplets of red onto her chin. Her hand, pressing against her chest, began to slip. The strength was bleeding out of her, pouring into the intricate woven patterns of the rug. "Declan," she whispered. It was a plea. The manipulative edge was stripped away, leaving only the primal fear of a dying animal. Declan just stood there, the heavy wool of his damp suit dragging on his tired shoulders. He watched the light in her eyes begin to fracture and dull. He didn't feel hatred. He didn't feel love. He felt an exhausted, hollow emptiness, a vast and quiet void where his life used to be. Then the silence of the room was broken by a sharp, electronic chirp. It wasn't a medical monitor. It was a two-way radio. The sound came from the hallway. Declan pivoted his wet leather soles, slipping slightly on the hardwood. He raised the Sig Sauer, his finger, immediately tightening on the trigger guard, the adrenaline cutting through the shock. He moved to the doorway and looked out. The hallway was empty. He followed the sound, retracing his steps toward the kitchen. The radio chirped again, followed by a burst of static. "Aris, sitrep, we heard a pop from the south perimeter. Talk to me." The voice was muffled, tinny. Declan rounded the corner into the kitchen. The slate floor was empty. The shattered porcelain of the espresso cup remained. The dark puddle of spilled coffee remained. But Dr. Aris was gone. Where the doctor had fallen, there was only a thick, smeared trail of wet blood leading toward the heavy fire door that connected the kitchen to the subterranean garage. Declan swore under his breath, a harsh, jagged exhale. He had hit the doctor hard, but not hard enough. Aris had woken up, crawled to his feet, and run. And he had a radio. "Aris, do you copy? Gate is locked. Transport is 2 minutes out. What was that noise?" Declan walked over to the smear of blood on the floor. He crouched, touching it with his left index finger. It was still warm. The doctor hadn't been gone long. He wiped his bloody finger on his slacks and stood up. The grief was officially over. The funeral was concluded. He was a dead man standing inside a sealed glass box, surrounded by heavily armed men who knew exactly where he was. He checked the magazine of his pistol. 12 rounds left. It wasn't going to be enough. Declan kicked off his Oxfords. They were too loud, too heavy. He stepped out of them, leaving the expensive leather near the kitchen island. He peeled off his wet wool coat, tossing it over a bar stool, followed by his suit jacket. He stood in his damp dress shirt and slacks, his stocking feet, silent against the cold slate. He needed to get to the basement. The estate was heavily fortified. The windows on the ground floor were 1.5 inches of polycarbonate glass, rated to stop a rifle round. The exterior doors were solid steel core. He had paid a fortune to ensure no one could get in. Now that same paranoid engineering ensured he couldn't get out. At least not quickly. He moved away from the kitchen, bypassing the main staircase in the foyer. It was too exposed, bathed in the grey, flat light of the rainy afternoon, filtering through the skylights. Instead, he took the servants' stairs, a narrow, uncarpeted wooden staircase hidden behind a panelled door in the pantry. His feet made no sound. His bad left shoulder throbbed a deep, rhythmic ache, syncing with his elevated heart rate. Halfway down the stairs, the lights went out. The sudden darkness was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over the house. The hum of the refrigerators died. The faint whir of the HVAC system spun down into silence. Elias's men outside had cut the main breaker. 3 seconds later, the emergency backups kicked in. They weren't designed for comfort. They were designed for combat. Low-wattage red LED strips flickered to life along the baseboards, casting long demonic shadows against the walls. The house was bathed in the color of a dark room, stripping away depth perception and making everything look flat and blood-soaked. Declan reached the bottom of the stairs, pushing open the door to the basement level. The air down here was cooler, smelling faintly of concrete dust and the ozone tang of the massive server racks housing the security feeds. He crept down the corridor, keeping his back pressed against the cinder-block wall. The red emergency lights cast his shadow long and distorted ahead of him. He heard the heavy metallic thud of the mudroom door upstairs being breached. They weren't waiting. Aris must have made it outside and told them Camille was compromised. They were coming in to clean up the mess. Clack, clack, clack. Tactical boots on hardwood. The sound drifted down the ventilation shafts, amplifying in the quiet basement. Heavy, deliberate steps. There were at least 3 of them, moving with disciplined spacing. His own men. Men whose kids he had bought Christmas presents for. Men he had trusted with his life. Declan swallowed the bitter taste in his mouth. He reached the end of the hall and punched a 4-digit code into a heavy reinforced steel door. The armory. The lock clicked a loud mechanical snap. He winced, pulling the door open and slipping inside. The armory was a windowless, climate-controlled vault. Racks of rifles lined the walls, smelling sharply of gun oil and brass. Declan didn't go for the heavy weapons. They were too long, too cumbersome for the tight corners of the house. He needed maneuverability. He grabbed a matte black Remington 870 pump-action shotgun from the rack. Short barrel pistol grip, brutal and effective for close quarters. He shoved a handful of heavy buckshot shells into his pockets, the brass cold against his thigh. He slung the shotgun over his shoulder and kept the Sig Sauer in his right hand. He stepped back out into the red-lit hallway. A shadow shifted at the far end of the corridor, near the entrance to the wine cellar. Declan froze. He hadn't heard the servant's stairs open. The intruder had come down the main spiral staircase, moving with impressive stealth. The figure stepped into the center of the hall. He was wearing dark tactical gear, a Kevlar vest over a black sweater. He held a suppressed carbine, tight to his shoulder, sweeping the barrel methodically left and right. Through the crimson gloom, Declan recognized the profile. Miller, the night shift supervisor. Miller took a step forward, his boots rolling heel to toe, exactly how Declan had taught him to walk silently. Declan didn't call out. He didn't ask for an explanation or try to negotiate. The time for words had died with Camille in the bedroom upstairs. Declan raised the Sig Sauer, aiming for the center mass, exposed above the Kevlar plate. He squeezed the trigger. The gun clicked. A dry, hollow sound. A misfeed. The hollow point had jammed on the feed ramp. The tiny metallic click sounded like a bomb going off in the quiet basement. Miller snapped toward the sound instantly. The suppressed carbine coughed a rapid oof, puff, puff, spitting sparks in the dark. Chunks of cinder block exploded inches from Declan's face. Concrete shrapnel bit into his cheek, drawing hot blood. Declan dove hard to his left, hitting the concrete floor with his bad shoulder. Searing pain lanced through his collarbone, stealing his breath. He rolled behind a heavy concrete support pillar as another burst of suppressed fire chewed up the floor where he had just been standing. Boss. Miller's voice echoed down the hall. It didn't sound angry. It sounded terrifyingly calm, conversational. Give it up, Declan. The house is locked down. We've got Aris. We know the wife is down. Elias just wants the accounts. Give us the passcodes to the offshore drives and you walk. It was a lie. A poorly constructed one. You don't cut the power and breach a house with suppressed weapons to negotiate. Declan ignored the pain radiating down his arm. He dropped the useless Sig Sauer. He unslung the Remington 870, pulling the pump back with a harsh metallic clatter that echoed aggressively off the concrete. He chambered around. The sound was unmistakable, a universal language of extreme violence. Miller. Declan called out his voice, a low, gravelly rasp. You're standing on top of the radiant heating pipes. Silence fell over the hallway. Miller stopped moving. The red lights flickered. What more? Miller asked, his tactical calm slipping just a fraction. Declan didn't explain. He didn't lean out to aim. He stayed behind. The pillar swung the barrel of the shotgun out low, aimed roughly at the floor, 20 feet down the hall, and pulled the trigger. The roar of the 12-gauge in the confined space was apocalyptic. The flash temporarily blinded him, washing out the red emergency lights. He didn't hit Miller. He hit the exposed high-pressure PVC junction box, mounted on the lower wall just behind where the guard was standing. The buckshot shredded the pipes. Instantly, a geyser of scalding 180-degree water erupted into the corridor. It hit the concrete floor and vaporized, filling the hallway with a thick, blinding, hissing cloud of white steam. Miller screamed. It wasn't a tactical sound. It was a panicked, high-pitched shriek as the boiling water sprayed across his exposed neck and hands. He fired wildly into the steam, the suppressed carbine spitting blindly. Declan didn't hesitate. He racked the shotgun, ejecting the smoking shell casing, and stepped out from behind the pillar into the thick, scalding fog. The steam was an absolute physical barrier. It didn't just obscure vision. It coated the lungs thick and heavy with the smell of mineral deposits and boiling iron. Declan stepped out from the cover of the concrete pillar, the vapor instantly plastering his damp dress shirt to his ribs. The heat was suffocating a wet, oppressive blanket that turned the freezing basement into a sauna. He moved low his stocking feet, finding traction on the rough concrete where the slick pool of boiling water hadn't yet reached. The hissing of the ruptured pipe was a deafening, continuous white noise, masking the sound of his breathing. Miller was thrashing on the floor somewhere ahead in the fog. The guard wasn't screaming anymore. He was making wet, ragged, gasping sounds. The carbine had gone silent. Declan advanced, leading with the barrel of the Remington. The red emergency lights barely penetrated the white cloud, diffusing into a sickly, pinkish glow. His bad shoulder screamed with every step, the muscle spasms radiating up his neck to the base of his skull. A dark shape materialized in the mist near the floorboards. Miller. The guard was on his knees, tearing frantically at his Kevlar vest. The boiling water had soaked through his collar, scalding his neck and chest. His face, illuminated briefly by the ambient red light, was a mask of blistered red ruin. He was pawing blindly for a sidearm strapped to his thigh. Declan didn't feel a surge of triumph. He just felt deeply, profoundly exhausted. These were the men who were supposed to watch his back. Now they were dying on his basement floor for a woman who despised them all. He closed the distance. Miller heard the scrape of cotton socks on concrete. The guard raised his hand, pointing a Glock blindly into the steam. Declan swung the heavy barrel of the shotgun, striking Miller's wrist with a sickening crack. The handgun clattered away into the mist. Miller let out a wet, choked sob, collapsing forward onto his uninjured arm. Declan didn't rack the shotgun. It was too loud, too definitive. He bypassed the weeping man, stepping over Miller's twitching legs, and kept moving toward the end of the corridor. The hissing pipe was directly behind him, now pushing the steam forward, clearing a small pocket of visibility near the secondary stairwell. The service stairs. The ones leading up to the mudroom. He pressed his back against the cold steel of the fire door at the base of the stairwell. The metal was vibrating slightly. Someone was walking on the landing above. Two distinct pairs of boots. They hadn't rushed down. They were waiting for the steam to clear, letting Miller flush the target out. Professional, methodical. Elias had trained them well. Declan checked the shotgun by feel. 1 in the chamber. 3 in the tube. 4 heavy, devastating shells. He reached into his pocket with his left hand, his fingers slipping on his own sweat, and pulled out 2 extra shells. He held them awkwardly between the knuckles of his trigger hand. He didn't try to open the door quietly. The hinges were heavy and would groan regardless. Instead, he took a step back, raised his right leg, and kicked the push bar with the flat of his heel. The steel door flew open, slamming against the cinder block wall with a concussive boom that rivaled a gunshot. The 2 guards were stacked on the landing, halfway up exactly where the stairwell bottlenecked. They flinched at the noise, their suppressed rifles snapping toward the open doorway. But the stairwell was instantly flooded with the pressurized, blinding steam from the basement, billowing upward like smoke from a chemical fire. Declan didn't look for a target. He knew the geometry of his own house. He aimed at the landing, finding the angle where the drywall met the oak tread, and pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, bucking violently against his injured shoulder. A constellation of heavy lead pellets tore through the wooden stairs, ripping the oak planks to splinters. A heavy thud sounded above him, accompanied by a sharp, surprised grunt. Declan pumped the action, clack, clack, ejecting the smoking hull and fired again into the cloud of sawdust and steam. A body tumbled down the narrow stairs, a cascade of limbs and tactical gear crashing onto the basement floor. The man didn't move. The second guard fired blindly down the stairwell. Suppressed rounds chewed into the doorframe inches from Declan's head, peppering his face with wood shards. Declan dropped to one knee, ignoring the burning scrape of a ricochet against his collarbone. He racked the shotgun one last time, aiming upward through the gap in the broken stairs. He fired. The return fire stopped instantly. A heavy weight slumped against the drywall above, followed by the slow metallic slide of a rifle clattering down the steps. Silence descended on the stairwell, broken only by the fading hiss of the pipe and the harsh, ragged rasp of Declan's own breathing. The air smelled of burnt powder, splintered oak, and the sharp, coppery tang of fresh blood. He waited for 10 agonizing seconds. Nothing moved. He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet space. He slung the empty shotgun over his back. It was useless now. The remaining shells dropped somewhere on the floor during the recoil. He retrieved the fallen guard's sidearm from the steps, a compact, fully loaded Glock 19. The grip was sticky, but it was a weapon. He stepped over the bodies, refusing to look at their faces. He didn't want to know their names. He didn't want to remember if they had wives or children. In this house, in this moment, they were just obstacles between him and the rain. The mudroom was destroyed. The heavy mahogany door leading to the garage had been breached with a battering ram, the expensive wood splintered and hanging off its reinforced hinges. The slate floor, the same heated floor that had dried his shoes an hour ago, was tracked with muddy boot prints and smeared with a long, thick trail of dark red. Dr. Aris hadn't made it to the cars. Declan followed the blood trail. It didn't lead to the garage. It veered sharply to the left toward the heavy glass door of the conservatory. The glass was shattered, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a central impact point where Oris had clearly thrown his own weight against it to escape the locked-down house. Declan stepped through the jagged opening, the cool, damp air of the Seattle evening hitting him like a physical blow. The conservatory smelled of wet earth, dying orchids, and ozone. The rain was coming down in sheets, beating a frantic rhythm against the glass roof. The red emergency lights from inside cast a bruised, purplish glow over the exotic foliage. Aris was lying face down in a bed of prized blue hydrangeas, just short of the exterior door leading to the greenhouse path. The doctor was still alive, but barely. His pristine charcoal suit was ruined, soaked through with rain and his own blood. He was dragging himself forward by his fingernails, his breath leaving his body in shallow, rattling wheezes. Declan walked over to him, his stocking feet squelching in the expensive potting soil. He stood over the doctor, the rain instantly plastering his hair to his forehead and washing the soot and blood from his face. Aris stopped moving. He slowly rolled onto his side, looking up at Declan. The man's face was a pale, slack mask of terror. The aristocratic arrogance was entirely erased, replaced by the pathetic primal realization that his wealth and his degrees couldn't stop the bleeding. "Declan!" Aris coughed, a thick rope of bloody saliva hanging from his lip. Don't do it. Elias will kill you. He has the accounts. He has everything." Declan looked down at the man who had monetized his grief. He didn't raise the Glock. He didn't feel the need to inflict any more violence on the pathetic creature bleeding out in the dirt. "He has the accounts," Declan agreed, his voice flat, completely devoid of inflection. "He has the money. He has a dead woman waiting for him at the airstrip." Aris blinked, his eyes losing focus. "Dead." "You played a dangerous game, Doctor," Declan said softly, turning away from the dying man. "You forgot that you were playing it in my house." He didn't wait to watch Aris take his last breath. He pushed open the heavy exterior door and stepped out onto the greenhouse path. The rain was a deluge, a freezing, chaotic downpour that stripped the last remnants of the artificial heat from his skin. The path was dark, winding into the dense old-growth pines that bordered the estate. This was the blind spot, the one perimeter weakness he had purposely left, unmonitored years ago, a paranoid fail-safe, for a day exactly like this. He began to walk. The mud sucked at his ruined socks, the sharp pine needles cutting into his soles. He didn't care. The physical pain was a grounding anchor, a sharp contrast to the numb, hollow void expanding in his chest. He thought about Camille lying on the Persian rug, her blood soaking into the wool. He thought about the 2 years he had spent, whispering apologies to a woman who was actively plotting his murder. He thought about the millions of dollars Elias Thorne was currently trying to wire from offshore accounts, completely unaware that his operation had just bled to death in a Mercer Island mansion. Let Elias have the money. Let him have the ashes of the empire. Declan Walsh was dead. The Mafia boss, the grieving husband, the predictable fool, all of them had died in that master bedroom. As he reached the edge of the tree line, the faint wailing siren of approaching police cruisers cut through the sound of the rain. The fire alarm triggered by the ruptured steam pipe had finally notified the county dispatch. The fortress was about to be breached by the state. Declan didn't look back at the sprawling, illuminated monstrosity he had built. He tossed the stolen Glock into a thick patch of blackberry brambles. He didn't need it anymore.